This is The Secrets of Mastery, a series of conversations with artisans about what it takes to master their craft and what their journey has taught them. I'm Pauline Bartoloni, and this is a production of Craftsmanship Magazine, a multimedia publication about artisans and innovators who are creating a world built to last. Today, we're talking with someone who sees the world from a bug's point of view. Dr. Doug Tallamy is an entomologist who's on a personal but far-reaching crusade to increase biodiversity on private land. He teaches wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware, and he's also co-founder of an organization called Homegrown National Park, where he's trying to reach millions with a message. So native plants in your yards, not ornamental non-natives, in order to restore the natural order of insects and animals that keep our food web strong and help alleviate the climate crisis. He's trying to convince the owners of 44 million acres of lawn across the country to rewild their front and backyards and be part of a movement of conservation on private land. I interviewed Doug Tallamy about how he's rewilded his own land in Pennsylvania and the art of his movement building. I start by asking Doug Tallamy, what's the first step landowners can take to be craftspeople of biodiversity in their own yards?
Step one is reduce the area of lawn. That 44 million acres of lawn is literally killing us. And when you have an area bigger than New England dedicated to this ecological deadscape, it makes it a low-hanging fruit. It's something most homeowners do have. Certainly in the East, we got a lot of lawn, and people don't know why. It's a status symbol, but we can change status symbols.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about what you mean by deadscape. Is that your term for a lawn? And what do you mean deadscape? I mean, we see worms, you can see bugs.
Okay, it's a relatively deadscape. First of all, you're putting all kinds of insecticides and other things on there to see as few of those things as possible. But compared to what ought to be in that space, it is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the biodiversity that ought to be living there. There are four things every property needs to do. It needs to support the local watershed. It needs to support pollinators. It needs to support the food web by passing on energy that plants capture from the sun and pass it on to other animals. And it needs to sequester carbon. Lawn does none of those things. For example, if you plant an oak tree in your yard, instead of a patch of lawn, that oak tree is doing all four things that your yard needs to do. It's supporting more biodiversity than any other tree genus in the country. Over 950 species of caterpillars depend on oaks across the country. And caterpillars are the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. So plants that make the most caterpillars are supporting the most life. It has a big root system so that it's managing the watershed well. It's dense and long-lived so that it's sequestering lots of carbon. And it even supports pollinators. That's what I mean by deadscape. Compared to an oak tree, for example, lawn it's not even measurable.
I want to talk to you about biodiversity in native plants. You say one promotes the other. Some people may think of biodiversity and native plants as at odds with each other. Like if you're only planting native plants, you're not bringing in a diverse set of plants. Can you talk about that? How does one promote the other?
Okay, that's a really good question. Diversity promotes stability and productivity in an ecosystem, but only if the plants that you're bringing into your yard are interacting with the other living things that are there. And this is where non-native plants fall down. Plants protect themselves. They really don't want to be eaten, so they load their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals. And the insects that use plants can only use them if they have the adaptations to get around those defenses. So native insects are really good at getting around the adaptations that native plants have, but they've never seen the defenses of non-native plants. So and these are generalizations, but for the most part, our native insects are very poor at using non-native plants. So it's a plant that's there, but it's not contributing ecologically So therefore, it's not really contributing to the diversity. I like to think of them as statues. They're there. You can have a diversity of statues in your yard, but it's not part of the living diversity that's running your ecosystem.
In terms of the harm of invasive species, if you compare them to people, I know plants aren't people, but people migrate across borders, populations change over time. What's the problem with plants migrating over time?
They don't perform the ecological roles that the native plants perform. Michael Pollan once suggested that we have a statute of limitations on being non-native. If you're here long enough, all of a sudden you're native. Well, you're native when you act like a native. And how do you know how you act like a native? You go to where that plant is native and see what it's contributing. A very good measure is how many species is it supporting? How many species of insects? So Phragmites, for example, it's the common reed. It's an invasive genotype from Europe. In Europe, it supports 175 species of insects. Well, it has been here for about 400 years. So after 400 years, it supports 5 insects here, and it supported them the very first year. So in other words, adaptations happen, but really, really slowly. So that's the problem with non-native plants. And you use the term non-native and invasive as if it was synonymous, and it's not. So all invasive plants are non-native, but not all non-natives are invasive. So if you plant, for example, a crepe myrtle throughout the south of the U.S., or camellias or ginkgos. Ginkgos would be a good example. They're not invasive. They don't move around. They stay where you plant them for a number of reasons. Yes, they're taking up space where you're planting them, but they are not pushing out the native plants that actually do support our food webs. But privet and buckthorn and burning bush and barberry and Callery pear and autumn olive and porcelain berry and on and on and on and on now occupy many, 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 many millions of acres in the U.S., monocultures of these things, where there are no natives mixing in nicely with them. So you have these non-native plants taking over natural areas that are supposed to be supporting our food webs. And that's the problem. They're no longer just statues in our yards. They are in our natural areas. And at least in the East, about a third of the vegetation in most, quote, natural areas is from Asia, not supporting the local food web. So that's why invasive plants are particularly detrimental. And a lot of people think that they're super plants. They deserve to be here. They're not super plants. It's just that the deer don't like them. White-tailed deer. We've got overabundance of deer throughout the country, and they'll eat the native plants, but not the non-natives. And so, of course, what do you end up with? The non-natives.
So our show is about the art of craftsmanship. Have you done this experiment in your own yard? Created biodiversity, and how did you do it? I'm sure that's a very long answer, but what are some of the basic steps?
It's not as long as you think. Our yard is sizable. We have 10 acres. It was part of a farm that was broken up. And the last thing I did was mow it for hay. So almost no woody plants and very few plants, period. Most of the plants that they were actually mowing were invasive plants from Asia, a whole slew of them. So step one was to get rid of them and then replace them with the native plants that ought to be in an eastern deciduous forest. We did that mostly through, it's called addition by subtraction. We kept removing the plants we didn't want and letting nature put the plants we do want back. Nature's good at doing that. So, for example, we've got a lot of oak trees. Now, I planted acorns, and that was easy. But blue jays brought in acorns. They can fly, a mile from the parent tree and tap that acorn below the soil, and they're going to go get it in the wintertime, but for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So they're very good at planting oak trees. They're very good at planting beech trees. All the beeches we have on our properties were planted by blue jays. Squirrels have planted a lot of things. There was a seed bank. There are native seeds in the soil that can sit there decades. And when they're released, you take away the competing plants on top, then they come up. So now our 10 acres is entirely vegetated with native plants. My measure of how well we're doing in supporting biodiversity is in 2 ways: the number of breeding birds that have bred on our property, and the number of moth species. Remember, moths are the meat and potatoes of local food webs. And I have the skill set to be able to count them, which I have been doing for the last 7 years. And I'm up to 1,268 species of moths that I have pictures of on our property because we put the plants that they need back. And we've recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres because we have the bird food, which is those caterpillars. So that's, to me, it's a measure of how resilient nature is. It's a measure of how successful the homeowner can be in terms of rebuilding biodiversity. It's a lot of fun. It empowers us. The earth has some serious issues, and a lot of people are upset about that. We've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the U.S. in the last 50 years. We've got global insect decline. We've got serious declines all over the place. But this is something you can do at home and see the results.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about how creating biodiversity may be a craft. Do you see it that way? And is it something that you can master?
Sure. The horticultural trade has been built around essentially painting our landscapes with pretty plants. So it's an art. It's an art form. And landscape designers and landscape architects go to school to learn how to perform this art. And it doesn't mean you have to be a landscape designer to be able to plant a native plant, but there are gardening skills involved. And just like any craft, you have to learn how to do it.
It seems like you're kind of mastering two things here. You're trying to bring biodiversity to your own yard, but you're also working to create a movement to create biodiversity. What is the most important thing or skill or lesson that you've learned while trying to create more biodiversity in your own yard?
I think that the most impressive lesson that I have learned is how easy it is. Just follow the few rules. Put the native plants back that belong there, and nature will repair itself. Don't try to fight it. Don't try to change the soil type. The local natives that belong where you are, they're already adapted to your soil type. They're adapted to your rainfall patterns. And I'm not talking about climate change where we're changing everything because that's making it harder, but start with what's adapted to your region and life will return. And it's been enormously entertaining. I mean, this year we got wood frogs for the first time in 23 years. They're wood frogs. They want a forest. Well, we started with a field, so now we have a forest and they're back.
I wanted to ask you lastly about the historical legacy of this craft of creating more biodiversity. People might think of it as like a trendy thing in gardening, but is there a historical legacy to that craft?
The native plant movement has been around for a while, but it's interesting. My brother-in-law, for 35 years, he's run a native plant nursery. And I remember early on talking about why do we have a native plant movement? And I would hear, well, you get a sense of place. It's the right thing to do. They're easier to maintain. But the native plant movement didn't really know why they were important. So that's the history of it. The fact that it's the native plants that are supporting the rest of life around you, when they heard that, they said, "Ooh, okay, now we really are important." Of course, the history of our reliance on non-native plants comes from our copying the landscapes in aristocracy Europe. The big lawn there was a measure of wealth. Only rich landowners that had enough slaves or enough sheep and could afford to not farm every square inch of their property had lawns. So, of course, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they brought that over here. But until we invented the lawnmower, it still was out of reach for the average guy. But the lawnmower made it possible. Okay, now we don't need sheep or slaves. We can actually maintain this ourselves. And then, of course, marketing came into it, and the big lawn care industry that says if you don't have a perfect lawn, you're a communist. That's what they said in the 50s, and people bought into it. You gotta be perfect. So you've got to put these herbicides on it to kill the clover. You might have a chinch bug in there, so you better load it with insecticides. And that really ecologically it went downhill very, very quickly. But it's a entrenched part of our culture. It is a status symbol. And if you don't maintain your property in a socially acceptable, neat way, and lawn is the easiest way to do that, then your neighbors don't like you. You know, then you get cited and everything else. So that's the history we're fighting here. And I do suggest that we in the native plant movement work hard at making attractive, socially acceptable landscapes. And if you do it right, your neighbors won't even know that you are using native plants. They don't know a native plant from a non-native plant. They do know neat and pretty. So we can do that.
Thank you so much, Doug Tallamy, for speaking with us.
You're welcome.
Doug Tallamy is an entomologist with the University of Delaware. Check out his work at homegrownnationalpark.org. That's it for this edition of The Secrets of Mastery. Music in this series is from Blue Dot Sessions. For more Secrets of Mastery episodes or more stories about craft, check out craftsmanship.net. That's craftsmanship.net. You can find us on Substack, too. Thanks for listening.